This episode of Insight has a twist, as our editor Conor MacBride interviews his internship supervisor Dr Pawel Romanczuk. Dr Romanczuk straddles the line of biology and physics at the Humboldt University of Berlin's Institute of Theoretical Biology. Enjoy listening! You're listening to Insight, the University of St Andrews Student Physics Society's podcast. I'm your host, Samuel Avery. Join us as we journey into the lives of St Andrews academics, discovering their passions, inspirations, and motivations.
This time in Insight, we are talking with Pawel Romanczuk, the principal investigator of the Collective Information Processing Group within the Institute for Theoretical Biology at the Humboldt University of Berlin. So, Pawel, what does your research group do?
Well, so we work in the area of theoretical biology, essentially. So we try to apply mathematics and methods from statistical physics to understand collective information processing in animal groups, for example, fish schools or flocks of birds or groups of insects. So on the one hand, we want to understand the coordination of these groups, but on the other hand, we also want to understand the function of this grouping behavior.
Very interesting. I'd like to hear more about your journey to where you are today. When did you decide that you wanted to be a scientist?
Oh, that's a good question. So basically when I started, during my A-levels, in Germany it's called Abitur, I was definitely sure I want to study, I want to go to university, and had a really tough time deciding which direction to go. And being a scientist was not at all on my radar at that time. So I was basically thinking, well, I want to become something like an engineer, working maybe a little bit with math because I was good at math, but basically building things, constructing things. Earning money was also kind of important at that time. Then actually when I first started to decide or wanted to decide where to go to, which subject to study, I went to some kind of introductory classes where the university and in particular the subject were presenting themselves to new prospective students. And I went to engineering departments. But then I realized quickly, well, it's really not what I'm interested in a sense, because they were very much emphasizing the economic aspect of managing and earning money and selling, advertising, and less the actual what I was fascinated by, constructing things, trying to understand how certain things work, and so on and so forth. So it was very much trying to attract people based on, you can do all these things with businesses and so on and so forth. So I realized I was less and less interested in doing actual engineering if this was the main kind of purpose of this in the end. And I decided to study physics because I was pretty good in physics. I was always fascinated by physics. And I never regretted that. It was one of the best choices in my life, basically. But still, when I started studying physics, I was very much on the applied, my interests were applied physics. So I wanted to build lasers, maybe semiconductor devices, something like that. So still on this engineering side. So I never actually considered becoming a scientist, maybe until, let's say, my second or third year of undergrad studies. At that time, I actually went to Manchester for a university exchange and did my bachelor degree in Manchester. And it went pretty good. And after that, because my marks and my results were so good, I had actually the opportunity in the UK to go directly for a PhD degree straight after the Bachelor, which is not possible in Germany and was not possible at that time in Germany. This was basically the point where I started to considering, should I go maybe for a PhD, maybe for a scientific career? But then I decided still to go back to Germany to finish my degree in Germany. But then I made my decision up that I want to go for a scientific career, basically.
What was your motivation to study for your bachelor's degree in the UK?
So basically after my second year, so there was this Erasmus exchange, or there's still this Erasmus exchange, and more or less from the beginning I knew I want to go abroad somewhere. Just to gain the experience, to go to a different country, to study maybe in a different country. I found it very exciting, this possibility. And there was this kind of restriction on the language. So my English was, I thought at that time, kind of okay. So I decided I should go maybe to an English-speaking country. And that restricted the choices quite a lot. Also, my sister actually lives in Birmingham. That's the reason why I thought, well, there will be also some kind of a possibility to visit my family more often there. But first, actually, I had the offer to go to Denmark, because there were apparently no places left in Manchester for this exchange from my university, and they offered me to go to Denmark. But then I decided, well, no, I told them I want to go to Manchester. I want to make it happen somehow. And then I was lucky that there was still a place left for me. So I went to Manchester for a year, more than a year, and it was really a great time there.
Very good. So what led you to where you are today, working at the Humboldt University of Berlin?
So after I finished my physics diploma, which is comparable to a master's, or was comparable to a master's in Germany, before the master's degree was introduced also in Germany, I was sure I want to go for a PhD, but I wasn't sure which direction. And throughout my studies, in particular after my stay in Manchester, I gravitated more and more towards theory and theoretical subjects, but also I was really becoming more and more interested in some kind of fundamental application of theoretical physics to topics beyond physics. Like, for example, biology. I was always interested very much in biology. And at that time, when I was deciding to go for a thesis, like a diploma thesis or master thesis, I was looking at different research groups all over Berlin and Potsdam, and what they have on offer, specifically in the area of nonlinear dynamics, statistical physics applied to biological systems. And I went, as I said, to different groups, different universities. This is a nice thing here in Berlin. We have such a high concentration of different universities, so you can really choose where you want to go. And then I just met this one postdoc who offered me to work on collective behavior and flocking in biological systems from a theoretical point of view. How can we describe flocks of birds or schools of fish by mathematical equation? And somehow this really got me, this kind of topic. I got really fascinated by this and decided to do this for my thesis. And this particular group was actually located at the Humboldt University. So although I was at a technical university, I decided to be partly supervised by this group at the Humboldt University in the physics department. And after I finished my diploma degree there was an opening in terms of a position for a PhD, thesis, for a PhD position. And after a very short kind of consideration, I decided to take this position because it was basically exactly the topic I kind of fell in love within a few months with. So I decided, okay, I want to do my PhD on this topic of modeling collective behavior in biological systems.
Was there someone or something in particular that guided you along your path to where you are today?
Well, there were always individual people who were very influential, and definitely I think there was quite a lot also of just, random events in a sense that kind of made the decision the one way or the other way. So, for example, as I said, I was very much aiming at working in something like semiconductor theory and really semiconductor lasers, and doing my thesis there in this area. And one particular reason for that was that I was also a very charismatic scientist at my home university, which was working in this area. And then, unfortunately, very tragic, he died suddenly, very unexpectedly at a very young age. And then I had to reconsider my whole kind of path, whether I really want to do that, and for what reasons I want to go into semiconductor theory and not something else. And this is basically where I decided I want to look a little bit broader. I also went for a kind of internship to the Cambridge University, where I was working in a group for atmospheric science, basically modeling clouds and convective processes. And this was also a very interesting experience to work in a completely different area, because it was atmospheric physics, it was more geography department, it was based in a geography department. So it was a completely different types of questions and interests. And that was also which convinced me even further that I want to look a little bit broader. If we have this kind of, with this mathematical background that I obtained in the physics, during my physics studies, how can we apply it to very different systems? Like, for example, the biological systems, or maybe even socioeconomic systems. And there's a very vibrant research going on in this direction for more than 2 decades now. And I was very fascinated by these different ways. But as I said, maybe the individual person which were kind of most influential at that time was this particular postdoc who introduced me to this collective behavior and swarming modeling, because to be honest, I thought at that time, well, the theory looks kind of not that complicated. I wanted to do like field equations and very complex stuff and solving problems by complex math. And he showed me like basically this bunch of coupled stochastic differential equations, which basically look like Newtonian equations of motion, describing the motion of each individual agent or fish or bird. And then they were just coupled by some simple interactions. So I thought, well, that's kind of straightforward. I can do that. You can maybe write some theory, you can simulate that. But the postdoc, this particular postdoc, Udo Erdmann, who was so fascinated, he was so enthusiastic about what he was working on. And that was just basically like a kind of gut feeling saying, well, if he's so enthusiastic about it, that must be a pretty cool topic. He became a friend later on. After that, he's definitely one of the most influential person during my whole career path. Together with, of course, my PhD supervisor later on, Professor Szymanski-Gaja, who is a great expert in stochastic processes and also has a very, very broad knowledge. But among all, or first of all, he's just a very, very a great scientist and a very great physicist who's really enthusiastic about doing actual science. So I remember my supervisor at some point just coming to me after the weekend, oh, look what I calculated just like over the weekend, and you should have a look at that and compare it with your simulation and your theories. And I was like, oh my goodness, what's happening here? So he was really enthusiastic as well. So I think they were like, him as well as this particular postdoc who introduced me to this topic in the very first place were probably the most influential.
So Pawel, you've mentioned that you've spent a lot of time living and studying in the UK. Did you notice any differences between living in the UK and living in Germany?
Oh yeah, for sure. So the culture is slightly different. Although it's still all like Western Europe, you could say. So it's not that far off. But there are like just little tiny differences which you notice after living a while in the UK and coming from Germany. But also if you come from UK and live in Germany. So for example, it seems like there's a very different attitude, for example, to partying on the weekends. So usually I was always surprised how determined the Mancunians were. Like the weekend is there, so let's get wasted, let's celebrate, and then on Monday everyone was pretty hangovered. But it was only a great weekend if you would be hangovered. So I was used to partying a lot in Germany, but it seemed a little bit more kind of not as focused and not as concentrated, and it was not always the weekend. Sometimes, unfortunately, we were also celebrating on Thursdays or during the week, and then as a student, of course, you can do that. But there was one thing that kind of a very slightly different culture in terms of like partying and so on. I definitely think at that time also there were quite some differences, at least from the university system, how you studied. So like the bachelor master degree was already there, always in UK that was the standard, whereas in Germany we had these diploma degrees, which usually meant that you had 5 years for a degree, so it was something like a bachelor and master combined. And it was also much more, in a sense, free, that you could choose which direction you go. So it was not that much like prescribed courses you had to do at that point to get this credit points at this point in this year, so that you have to finish. But it was much more up to you whether you want to do this or want to do that. So you could choose what you're interested in, or maybe a little bit more, which also came at the price that sometimes people just got lost. So with this less structure. So I think like the university system in UK at that time had much more structure than in Germany. And that meant that on the one hand, it just gave you a little bit like a clear path where to go. Whereas in Germany, you could try you a little bit more out, maybe do this or do that. But it meant that in general, you also studied much longer. So instead of like a 3+2 or 3+1, whatever you have in the UK, it was more like 5 to 6 years in total. And some people were studying like for 10 years and more. So it was kind of had plus and minuses. But I think that also changed very much the attitude of students at that time. So the British, I had the impression at least the British students were very focused and trying, because also a university or the degree cost money, you had to pay fees. Whereas in Germany it was always free, so you had to be much more focused in the UK. And I think it definitely changed the attitudes of the academic culture for the students quite a bit.
You work in a very interdisciplinary field, Pavel. Do you consider yourself more a physicist or a biologist?
Definitely a physicist. Well, I'm always saying I'm kind of a physicist gravitating towards biology, and depending who I talk to, I also sometimes refer to myself as a theoretical biologist, which is also true. But like really, on a fundamental level, I still would see myself as a physicist, and this is actually true, to my knowledge, to a lot of physicists working in this field, that they still view themselves as physicists because there's this kind of very fundamental way how you approach problems, which you learn in physics, which is very helpful to approach problems also in other disciplines. But this is maybe one of the very defining features of really like looking at this bottom-up, starting from very idealized, simple models. You could call it a little bit like a very reductionist approach, but really trying to understand the complexity in a systematic way. And this is one thing that physics is really great at. There's decades and centuries of development in this area. So physics really developed along those lines. And I think this can be very helpful to understand also complex systems outside of physics. But I don't view myself, I would never claim that physics is in any sense superior or something like that to biology. It just gives a different view on biological systems. And what I find most fascinating about this interdisciplinary field is that there's actually this true exchange. So I learn a lot, every day I learn a lot about the fascinating biology of the organism I'm working with, I'm studying, and I'm really fascinated by all these experiments that my collaborators do. But on the other hand, I try always to bring in this kind of physics way of thinking about things, saying, okay, let's forget now for all the complexities of the biological system, let's start from the simplest possible model that we can have for the system and see how far does it get us. And at some point, you realize, well, this is maybe just too simple model to explain the full complexity of real biological system, and this is where the things start to get interesting. And then you can really have to understand what is it which makes the biological systems different from this very idealized, simplistic physics systems. And this is where the true interdisciplinary exchange takes place, which I find so fascinating.
You work in an institute focused on theoretical biology. What is theoretical biology, and how does it compare to just biology?
So theoretical biology first tries to develop theories for the living systems. And what I just described in terms of the physics approach, I think it's, it very much also describes the approach theoretical biology takes. So trying to find theories or define theories, develop theories for living systems, which allow us mathematical descriptions, first of all, of these complex systems, but also generate some predictions which can be then tested in actual experiments. And biology in itself was traditionally, and it still is very much empirically driven by experimental observation, by field observations. Now we have all this fascinating new technology of molecular biology, systems biology, where you can basically switch off and on particular genes and see what's happened to the mechanism. But because of the complexity of the living systems, it's sometimes very, very hard to understand how different subunits of the systems interact together. So even if you have this great experimental tools, how to manipulate them, you switch something on and suddenly you see something else happens on an organismic level, so on a level above. So you see, okay, there's something going on there. But this could be this, or it could be that. So there are many possible ways how this particular switch could affect the effect that you see. And this is where theory comes in. And here you try to start with simple theories to understand and really to generate prediction. Okay, if I have this theory of the living system, I can put in mathematical equations. I can try to turn on this knob and see what happens to the behavior of the overall system, and basically generate predictions for the experiments, and trying really to get a fundamental mechanistic understanding of how the systems work. And this is, and I think theory is crucial really to get this fundamental understanding, as it allows us to basically, as it always should be in science, generate testable predictions. But as I said, in biology, because it was so much empirically driven, there was always less of an emphasis on this kind of fundamental theories in contrast to physics. So this is a still very young field, and there's still a lot of, let's say, progress to be made. But it's, of course, it's also very complicated. So it's really, the progress is maybe slower than sometimes I would wish for.
So how are theoreticians perceived by experimental biologists?
Well, that's a good question. So in general, I would say, so there's maybe, well, there's a whole spectrum of attitudes towards theoreticians from the experimental side. Starting from this kind of very, let's say, rather negative attitude, we'll say, oh, they just putting some weird equations on there and they have no idea about the actual real systems, up to actually very open experimentalists, which really see a theory as the something really helping them also to guide their experimental work, and also that there's a fruitful exchange between those. And to be honest, I haven't met many of the, maybe I was lucky, but I haven't met many biologists of the first kinds who would be rather ignorant of theory. So I had always very great and very good experience with the people I work with, who are always were very interested in theory, were open to modeling questions, were interested in discussing the relation between the theory and the experiments. And I think, especially in my, as I said, in my kind of larger circle of collaborators, I definitely have the impression they value theory very much.
Can you tell us a bit more about biophysics in general? What questions are people trying to answer?
Well, so biophysics is, of course, a field which is not that young anymore. It basically started from the very first, if you think of Brown, for example, who looked at Brownian motion already at the end of 19th century. Well, one idea was to see whether there's some animate force driving this random motion of this little pieces of dirt or something that he observed under the microscope. So you could claim that that was already kind of a first biophysics approach, like looking at this very fundamental random motion and seeing whether there's something about life being manifested in this random motion. And of course it turned out that it doesn't have anything to do with life, it's a pure physics phenomenon, but there were always people who were trying to apply theories from physics also to living systems already from the very early stage on, like early 20th century, for example. So in my field, there were like experiments. So I worked on a theory of so-called active Brownian particles. So how can we describe basically individual biological motion by stochastic differential equation in the same way we describe Brownian motion? But there were like people in the 1920s, like Firth and Albers, who looked at the motion of microorganisms under the microscope, and they showed basically that, well, the mean square displacement of this organism can be perfectly described by the theory of Brownian motion of Einstein, which was developed purely for non-living systems. But the mean square displacement grows linearly in time, as for ordinary Brownian motion, also for these organisms. So they basically perform some sort of random walk motion. But what they measured at that time already is that the actual diffusion coefficient of this little microorganisms is much, much larger than what you expect simply from the size and from the physical properties of this organism. And this is basically the first kind of, in my opinion, first experimental evidence of an actual active Brownian motion, living motion, and this was already in the 20s, like 1920s, so more than 100 years ago. But I think the biophysics in general it's much broader than just, of course, looking at under things under the microscope. So biophysics, I think there's still a huge amount of research, and there was traditionally a domain of biophysics, or prime domain of biophysics, was to look at the physical properties of biological matter, in particular cells, for example. So, what do membranes consist of, like cellular membranes? So what is their physical chemical composition? How do ion channel works, for example? So channels which transport matter from inside to the outside of the cell, or vice versa. So what are really the physical properties of these ion channels? So this is definitely a very active field of research of biophysics. Another active field of research of biophysics is, for example, like when you think of cells, they they are pretty complicated structures. So it's not like a crystal consisting of a regular array of atoms, but you have all sorts of structures inside the cell, like for example a network of microtubules and actin structures, the so-called cytoskeleton, which gives a structure to a cell, which can be remodeled. And since years now, I guess maybe for a decade or two, there's a very active research really understanding the physics of this complex cellular processes on all scales, starting from the molecular scale to the scale of the whole cell. So I would say this is the prime, still the prime research direction of biophysics. And that means that basically my research, which is more really on a larger scale, looking at fish in school, is something rather exotic even for the biophysics community. But nevertheless, I would still consider it within this field of biophysics, or more generally speaking, biological physics. So really physics of biological systems.
Pawel, is there a big question in biophysics or in your research in general that you would like to hear answered in your lifetime?
This is a difficult one. There are so many questions, but the question is like, what is the big question? I think it is difficult to tell, in particular because biophysics in itself is so diverse and so fragmented. So it's, for example, different from like elementary particle physics or something like this. So there's nothing like a grand unified theory in biophysics, and I don't think that people really would consider this a kind of meaningful enterprise to search for something like great unified theory of biological systems. But there are many very important questions all along the biology and biophysics, which are definitely very important and fascinating and still open, which I hope to see solved in the future. Well, I guess for me particular, what I'm really interested in is how does it come that biological systems are both very complex but also very robust in a sense? And what are the fundamental mechanisms which leads to this robustness but also adaptability of biological systems? And I think there are some ideas how this comes about, but there's still very much an open question. So how, for example, in my particular questions, if we think of any complex system which tries to process information, how do the system manage to operate in this particular parameter range where they're still very responsive to external perturbations, but also not being completely random all the time. So somehow this is a very, very fascinating problem, and it's related to some fundamental physics theories from the 80s and the 90s on so-called self-organized criticality, where people suggested a mechanism for that, and developed some very simple theories. But there was always the question: well, yeah, that's like just a nice theory, but this is not what the real systems do. And now there's growing evidence, for example, that there might be something there, that, for example, the brain might be really operating in a special parameter regime. And what I would love to see, whether we can really identify this fundamental principle, how maybe the brain, but not only the brain, but any biological system is able to tune itself in a self-organized manner towards this particular parameter range, which is best for biological systems to operate in. But I think this is very much biased by my own research. I think a more fundamental question in biophysics in particular, and more physics-related question, is the question: is there something like a theory comparable to thermodynamics, which can be also formulated for biological systems, for truly non-equilibrium systems? So can we write down something like a state equation for any non-equilibrium system, like the classical state equation from thermodynamics? Can we do the same, maybe in a slightly more complicated way, but also for non-equilibrium systems, irrespective of this complex microscopic dynamics that might go on? If we go to a larger scale, is there like a fundamental equation describing all these different non-equilibrium systems? And at least from what I know in my area, there has been quite some progress into this direction, but there's still a lot of open questions. And this is basically unknown. So we have a lot of theories for so-called thermodynamic equilibrium, like for classical physics systems, non-living systems, where we have just a temperature, and the system is in equilibrium with this temperature bath surrounding it. But this is, up to now, there's still a lot of ongoing research whether non-equilibrium systems, which are all living systems, all biological systems, whether we can redescribe it by the same type of generalized theories. And I think that would be probably the biggest question, which would be really fascinating to see maybe solved within my lifetime, having like this grand theory of non-equilibrium systems.
When working in your field, do you have to adapt the way you explain and use physics?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's very different to talk about physics to physicists versus talking about physics to biologists. And this is basically true for any interdisciplinary collaboration, that you need to find a common language. And to be honest, I think most of this kind of maybe problems, or maybe just like hostilities, I would say, in that way, between different subjects, or like basically a lack of understanding, because there's a lack of using a common language, but also there's a lack of being willing to use a language which the other side understands, and try to kind of transfer the core concepts, and also trying to make clear what are the actual relevant questions for this discipline versus this discipline, because they are just very different disciplines and they have very different questions. But I think that both, for example, physics and biology, they can very much inspire each other in various ways. But for this is required. For this to happen, it is just crucial that people talk to each other and also try to convey the basic ideas in a language that the other side understands. So basically, talking about physics systems, about physics to biology audience, I always have to remind myself to explaining the most fundamental concepts, which I wouldn't need to explain to physicists, really try to explain them to biologists as well, because they just don't learn that, they don't know that, and this is like a fundamental to understanding all what comes after that. And if you just from the start come with your heavy statistical physics jargon and talk to them about phase transition and so on and so forth, if they don't know what a phase, like a physics phase is, then you just lose them immediately from the start, and then they just see you as just one of these theoreticians who just talk this weird stuff.
Do you ever have difficulties understanding the more biological aspects of your research?
Oh yeah, well, yeah, for sure. Especially if you very new to this, then you realize there are so many proteins and so many different mechanisms how cells work in the body and so on. And if you particularly listen to some experimental talks where people try to manipulate the system, as I said, by some knockout experiments or something like that, then you just realize suddenly, wow, this is complicated. This is, you learn all these acronyms for different proteins, and you hear them on, and you immediately forget them again, and you need a lot of time to navigate roughly, in this kind of very complex universe of biophysical systems, especially if you're coming from the outside. If you're lucky to be, for example, in a master's degree for biophysics, something like that, where you have both from the start, of course it gets much, much easier because you already learned this during a degree. But I did a classic physics degree, so learning about, in particular, cellular physics or cellular biophysics, I would say I just know very, very few things, but at least I have a rough idea what people speak about now when I listen to such talks. This was different a couple of years ago.
So, Pawel, if you weren't researching in a biological field, what area would you be researching in?
Well, I would be definitely probably, again, this is my particular bias, somewhere within statistical physics and non-equilibrium processes, stochastic processes. So anything related to noise and fluctuations really fascinates me. And sometimes even noise is always considered something bad or something that actually we would try to minimize, but sometimes noise can have also some constructive role, and there's been some fascinating research over the last 30 years about something like stochastic resonance, for example, and all these sorts of effects where the noise may actually play a constructive role in processing information or pattern formation and so on and so forth. So I think this is definitely one field where I already worked a little bit on. I probably wouldn't have hard time to go back to. Yeah, I think that would be it.
If you weren't a scientist, what job would you be doing?
There was a second kind of career that, well, I wouldn't call it career, but my second interest was actually politics. And I was actually thinking about studying political science and not physics. I decided for physics, and I never regretted it, but I always was very interested in political science and history and so on and so forth. And so that even did some courses on political science before I graduated from physics, just as a kind of side track. And then I also got involved with an NGO where we were doing like youth projects on exchange, in particular with Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and trying to do common projects on topics of civil society, politics, history. And this is something definitely I could imagine doing as well, going more in this direction. So working either for NGOs or in politics on political institutions.
Do you ever consider the applications of your research? For example, it is suggested that it could be applied to autonomous vehicles.
Oh yeah, this is definitely, as a scientist you should always think about not only, what is your immediate question that you want to answer, what fascinates you, but also what are the broader implications. And you also need to justify why is it important to study this particular question. And I think, although this shouldn't be, this should be always like at least in the back of your head. So for sure, like trying to understand how fish move together, how biological systems coordinate their motion without a centralized control is definitely a possible way also to develop new algorithms for artificial systems. So how robots could move together, and how this flock of robots without a centralized control could be very robust to losing in one individual robot, but still interact together to solve complex tasks. Like, for example, exploring a new environment after a disaster, for example, something like that, where it might be dangerous for humans to go in, or maybe even in space where you could think of a flux of robots exploring new planets or something like that. Of course, this is still very much science fiction, but people already do that. People already develop algorithms for robots which are very much motivated by biological systems.
Is there something in the field of biophysics or your research in general that you think that people don't fully appreciate?
Well, yeah, especially from physics. I had this criticism a couple of times, and this was actually a funny incident, a funny episode once. So I went to a talk back in my old department where I did my PhD, and there was this one postdoc who told me, "Oh, so you're moving more into biology?" I said, yeah, I'm really interested, and it's like going pretty good. And he said, "Oh yeah, it's much easier, right?" And I was like, "No, it's not." So this is like, I think there's a fundamental understanding that people think, oh yeah, everything outside of like hardcore physics is just simple and easy. And I would say this is definitely wrong. It is just different, and very much different. So in physics, in particular, if you think of theoretical physics in its classical areas, usually you build on this very solid foundation where like generation of physicists have built this theoretical kind of groundwork and then this foundation for whatever theory you build on top of it. So you kind of it's like a house or like a tower which is very solid, and you build on top of it. Whereas in biological physics, or in this area where I am at, this is like very young, very still very much developing field. So we don't have this very solid foundation, but it's more like a shaky raft on a lake or something like that, or on a swamp, where you try to build something which is stable, like a kind of theoretical underpinning to move upwards to build a larger theory. But it can happen that you just realize at some point that where you started from was just not solid enough, then you have to start from scratch. So which is much more kind of dynamic and fluid, gives you, of course, much less certainty about certain things, certain assumptions that you make in your theories. And this is why I say it's very different. It's not necessarily easier. I don't think it's easier at all. It's just very, very different in terms of how you have to approach systems, how much you can rely on your fundamental assumptions, for example, what the interactions are between individual units. In physics, we have pretty good understanding of the fundamental forces which govern the interaction of matter and light, and so on and so forth. In biology, in a lot of the systems, we don't have a clue about what the actual interactions are. Well, maybe we have something like a tiny clue, but it's still very much uncertain. So this is where this kind of metaphor of this very shaky foundation and this more like a raft which we still need to solidify comes from.
So after the Second World War, Germany was divided into two separate countries, East and West Germany. In 1990, Germany was reunified with the East joining the West again. Pawel, were you in Berlin during the reunification?
Yes, I was actually, but there was kind of also a very special story because I was born in Poland and moved to West Berlin in April '89, so just half a year before the wall came down. And I was at that time just, I think, 10 years old. So I still remember that, but I was still a little kid. And so I still remember being in West Berlin, and because I came from Poland, which was also a former communist country, or a communist country at the time, I was really fascinated by West Berlin, by this Western lifestyle and so on and so forth. It was really exciting. And then, half a year later, while being in Berlin, the wall came down. And at that time, I was not really a long time in Germany still, so I didn't really understand how much big of a deal this was. But I realized, well, there was definitely something special. Because, that was, of course, all over the news. You could view people from East Berlin coming for the first time to West Berlin. So there was really this kind of, even maybe if I didn't understand fully the whole implications, geopolitical implication of what just happened, the wall came down and so on and so forth, I definitely understood there was something big happening at that time. But being a kid, I didn't go to the wall in the middle of the night when it came down. I was in my bed sleeping, and then just realized on the next day the news were full of this great news.
Do you know if science research changed after the reunification?
Yeah, well, in Germany, I think it was particularly hard, for example, for former GDR scientists, so scientists from East Germany, because there was, of course, a well-developed academic sector as well. But after the wall came down, suddenly this whole structures broke down as well. So on the one hand, all these great scientists coming from East Germany, they had also this access to this new maybe technologies and broader or much more possibility to exchange with their peers from Western Germany and also from Europe and all over the world. But on the other hand, for a lot of them, it was really tough because the institutes, the departments closed down. A lot of them had to change jobs and couldn't stay in academia. So for this particular group of people, like scientists from Eastern Germany, I think there was quite a strong and very dramatic change that happened there. Overall, in terms of science in Germany, I don't think that this changed very much the approach to science. I think the great thing about science is kind of a little bit independent of this political turmoil. So the scientific method stands as it is. And this is clear what good science, what bad science is, irrespective of the larger geopolitical implications. Although, as a scientist, one should also never see oneself completely isolated from this. So there's definitely a responsibility with our expert knowledge in various areas also to see how this affects the society as a whole and how can we contribute to the society as a whole.
How vital is the European Union to being a scientist in Germany?
Yeah, so I think it's actually pretty important for scientists in Germany, in particular, or predominantly also because there's a lot of European funding for science. So there's this Horizon 2020 program where scientists can apply with their project ideas, and they are the so-called ERC grants by the European Research Council, which are also very prestigious awards, and they provide quite a lot of funding money for individual projects, individual people as well. I guess it's also not only about the research funding, but for me, as I said, I benefited from this European exchange program, Erasmus, already early on during my studies. And that was really important for me to gain this international experience, to have the opportunity to go to UK and study there, to learn a different academic culture already early on during my career. So I think it definitely plays a huge role.
What do the German people, in particular scientists, think about the UK's decision to leave the European Union?
I think a lot of people were really devastated by it. Most of the people didn't really believe this could happen until it happened, basically. And I think there was kind of similar among parts of the British population as well. I think, and this is something that a lot of scientists, but also non-scientists, realize that this is just like this daunting task in front of the British government or this kind of European Union and British government together, how to make it happen, because there are so many implications on all sorts of levels, starting from just fundamental questions on how to organize all sorts of areas of life. So and there are so many regulations that need to be reviewed, that need to be changed, that need to be renegotiated between them. And I think it's just like extremely demanding and complex, and I'm actually scared about what happens there. Not scared because of European Union, because there's still, you could argue, there's a larger entity, and they kind of that would want to be nice for them, but that they will realize. But I'm actually scared for the UK, for Great Britain, in a sense that this might definitely. I think in the end it will be overall probably to their disadvantage, and I hope that somehow this negotiation go that well, and one can find the best possible solution given the circumstances of this decision. That it's still there is some kind of a reasonable solution to how the European Union and Britain will kind of interact in the future, even if Britain leaves the European Union.
Pavel, what do you like to do in your spare time? Do you have any hobbies?
Yes, so I do sports. Definitely, I enjoy a lot of sports. My primary kind of sports hobby is definitely karate. So I've been doing karate for it's almost 20 years now, and I still train regularly. Try to do it at least once, twice a week. Although I have to say, work sometimes interferes with that. But not only that, I also do with my wife ballroom dancing on a regular basis. So this is our common hobby together. But also we view it also as a part of a sport or sport activity. Also, I do snowboarding in the winter if I manage to find some time to do that. I like playing soccer, although that's more like a kind of irregular. When just a bunch of people come together, then I'm very happy to play a little bit of soccer. Well, apart from that, one hobby is definitely anything related to computer. So although I'm probably not the youngest, I still enjoy computer game in between, because I grew up with computer games. So if I have, unfortunately I don't have that much time for that anymore. But this is definitely something I also enjoy still very much.
Yes, that's a very long list.
Are there any scientists that you think deserve more recognition?
Well, I don't know, to be honest, of any like big names or like names that anyone in the audience would probably know. But I think always, when you are in academia, you meet this very bright, very fascinating people, which don't receive enough attention and have like these great ideas, but somehow fail to maybe get a greater recognition within the community. So I don't know, I wouldn't name any particular names, but there are always this, I would say, not so big names like this junior scientists, which would deserve definitely more recognition.
So if you could travel back in time, is there a particular event that you would witness?
Oh, Oh, wow. That's a tough one. Yeah, I would love to see the invention of the wheel. I don't know whether it was a singular instance of time, but this is just such a fundamental kind of event in the human history. I would love to see where it happened the first time, how people came about that. Was it like an evolutionary process that they kind of had something like a square thing in between, or just logs of wood which they were pushing the burns about, and how someone realized, we can make a wheel out of this. That would be cool.
What do you think is the most interesting animal? Not necessarily one that you've studied.
Most interesting animal? I think the slime mold is pretty fascinating. So these are this organism which can live on its own, so like a single cell organism, just crawl on itself. But when the life conditions get bad, these slime molds come together and form this fruiting body. So they collectively form like an aggregate where to survive this harsh environmental conditions. And after the conditions get better, this fruiting body breaks up, and only few of these actual initial cells that formed will survive, and the others will die. So they sacrifice themselves for the greater good of their kind of conspecifics. So this slime mold, Dixostelium discoidum, I think it's called, that's definitely like a very fascinating organism on all sorts of levels.
Okay, now we're going to move on to some quick-fire questions, but feel free to elaborate on your answers if you wish. Do you have a favourite genre of music?
Oh, it changed so much over the years. Good music.
Good choice. Do you have a favorite song?
Yeah, but I don't remember the name anymore. So yeah, it's some kind of. Wait a second. I do have a couple of songs that I like, but I won't say there's one particular favorite song.
Okay.
Do you have a favourite non-academic book?
I do. Game of Thrones.
Okay.
Do you have a favourite movie or TV show?
Game of Thrones.
Do you have a favorite place in Berlin?
Favorite place in Berlin? This is also a tough one. Yeah, I guess the campus here. I like this campus here very much of the Humboldt University.
Do you have a favourite holiday destination?
Anywhere where there's a beach, sun, and warm seawater. You can stay in for hours. That's great. That's my favorite holiday destination.
What are 3 things that you would bring to a desert island?
3 things that took me a while. I would have to think about it, but definitely it would be like a giant notebook with a pencil, so I could write things down, maybe even, do some math if I feel like. The second thing would be a computer, even if it's not connected to the internet, just to be able, sometimes we cannot solve things on paper, so, you can do some, calculations there, but you can also have a computer game, even without the internet, to spend a little bit of time. So I'm definitely I'm a little bit addicted to working with computers. And the third thing is probably, you're right, it would be probably like a coffee machine, to have a very good, decent coffee on the island.
To finish up, are there many opportunities for a non-German speaker to study in Germany?
I would say so, yeah. So of course, knowing the language would be definitely beneficial and would help a lot. But in particular, in like large cities like Berlin or Munich or Cologne or something like that, most of people speak English. There are actually a lot of degrees already being offered in English as well, like master degrees. So, and if you're at a PhD level, like after you graduated and you're going for a PhD, then definitely English is like the lingua franca in academia in Germany as well. So for example, in my lab, we have always people from different places and we usually speak English all the time. So I would say at this level, as a postgraduate, this is, without knowing German, you can still very much, this is not much of a problem to study and work in Germany.
Would you recommend it?
Oh, definitely, yeah. So it's different from UK, but I think it is exactly the thing which makes it also a bit more exciting, just to gain new experiences, learn a different culture. It's a very diverse, and Germany has a very good beer as well. So I definitely recommend that.
Thank you for joining us, Pawel. It's been very interesting.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Insight, the University of St Andrews Student Physics Society's podcast. I was your host, Samuel Lavery. Thanks to all the wonderful academics of St Andrews. Join us in the future as we learn more of the people making our education. This podcast was produced by myself and our publicity officer, Conor MacBride. To find out more about the Physics Society and what we do, please find us on Facebook or Google St Andrews Physics Society for our website. Goodbye!